Greetings, greetings, greetings. Welcome back to Intro to Sociology, summer lecture. Today we are going to talk about Black feminist thought and intersectionality. Um, you should have read a chapter out of Patricia Hill Collins' book, Black feminist thought. And here is where we kind of get to the part of the semester where we start to amalgamate or bring together different ideas and different identities and how they work together to help form our sociological imagination and our sociological thought. So we've talked about class, we've talked about race, we've talked about gender. But there is an idea or a concept in sociology that oftentimes we use in order to make sense of the fact that as human beings, we are dynamic. We are dynamic entities, meaning we are not linear, we're not singular, we are pluralistic. And in our pluralism, we embody various ideas, various realities at one time. So that's what we're going to talk a little bit about today. Okay. So this idea that as dynamic human beings, we embody more than one identity, more than one perspective at a time, it informs the unique ways in which we look at the world. It also informs the unique ways in which the world looks at us. And so in order to capture that reality, we have this, we have this idea, this approach to understanding called intersectionality. And we're going to talk about that. But before we go into that, again, I like to lay out a kind of like a historical framework to give us an understanding of the type of discussion that we're going to have. Okay. So we're going to talk a little bit about critical race theory. We're going to talk a little critical race theory, which leads us into talking about Black feminist thought, which leads us to talk about intersectionality. All right, so if we go to the next slide, it's very important that before we even talk about Black feminist thought and intersectionality, we have to talk about critical race theory. Critical race theory has been a very poignant topic within American politics, US politics, in maybe the past year or two, specifically in Florida. Okay, so critical race theory has been a thing for a long time, right? At least since the 1980s, for sure. And it started out as something that was, or a theoretical approach that was centered or kind of limited in a formal way to law schools, right? And then as time goes on, it began to expand and grow out of law schools into other schools of thought, and out of other schools of thought into other levels of education. Okay. Now, critical race theory is something that is presented to even, high schoolers, middle schoolers, if you will, on a certain level, obviously, right? So let's go all the way back, right? First of all, let's look at what critical race theory, how it got started. Okay, so critical race theory got started in about the 1980s. So in the 1970s, or post-civil rights movement, you have more and more middle class, educated African Americans who now have the opportunity to enter into schools that they were formerly isolated from. Law schools, predominantly white law schools, predominantly white jobs, institutions that for a long time used Jim Crow ideas and racist ideas in their student acceptance practices and their employment practices. Now this is formally and federally illegal. So this opens the door for now educated, more middle-class African Americans to get jobs. This opens the door for things like affirmative action. This gives the opportunity for the expansion of the Black middle class, right? And so with more opportunities being given to middle class African Americans, educated people, you have more and more of them being accepted into law schools that generally they would have been rejected from. So there were a group of, in the 1970s, some Black law students who are now entering into top law schools, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, UCLA, etc. When they enter into these schools, they're being taught that while society has made it difficult for people that are not white, people that are not male, to achieve success, while there is clearly racism, sexism in our society, while inequality is and still persists, even post the civil rights era, the law is the great equalizer. Meaning if you commit a crime, you do something wrong, and you get arrested, you get a court date, because our society is built on a democracy, right? Because it is built on a republic where people have an equal right to voting, an equal right to, and they are all equal under the law, under this kind of meritocratic standing. Once you get in front of the law, once you get in front of the judge, once you have your day in court, your race does not matter. Your class does not matter. Your gender does not matter. It is the great equalizer. If you were wrong based on the evidence, you will be convicted. If you did nothing wrong based on the evidence, you will not be convicted. The law, though not perfect, it is a much greater equalizer in our society than almost any other institution or any other form of government or any other form of social life. And so there is this notion that race and racism is not as persistent in all parts of our society because the law is fair. The law is unbiased. The law, American law, works. Now you have these folks, right? Black, though some of them may be educated, or though they may be educated, though many of them are middle class, they are still Black and Latino, actually. And so they're coming to these schools and they're like, that doesn't sound right. Right? Yes, we're coming to law school. Yes, we want to make a difference. Yes, we want to practice law. Yes, we're practicing law so that it is applied fairly to people across the board. But in the way that it stands now, that's not the case. What you are teaching in these schools is not the reality that we're coming from our families back at home, from our communities back at home. This is not what we're experiencing. This is not what our fathers and our uncles or our mothers and daughters and sisters, when they get in front of the courtroom, they don't experience justice all the time. When they come in contact with police, they're not experiencing justice most of the time, right? I have fathers and brothers that are locked up for crimes that they did not commit. So the law is not the great equalizer in this experience, and race is still very much an issue in all parts of our life, including the law. And racism is still very much alive and well, even in this post-civil rights era. So to them, this was not accurate. And so these law students decided, well, when we graduate and when we enter into the law profession, we're going to make a difference. We're going to do something different. And we're going to address these inaccuracies that we've learned in our law schools. And so you have folks like Richard Delgado, right? You have folks like Kimberly Crenshaw. You have folks like former professor, former Harvard University professor and former professor of Barack Obama, Derek Bell, who all began to come up with this notion of how to address the way in which race plays this structural systemic role in the lives of people of color, particularly Black people, Black and Latino people in the United States. And they begin to publish works, publish studies, publish law analyses that explain this idea that was counter to what they had been taught. These ideas that race and racism did not function off of meritocracy, that the United States was not a meritocratic society, but in fact, race was at the very core of our understanding and the realities of US life. This became a key and continuing philosophy in their works, in their published works, in the published works of their students. And this began to lead legal scholarship down a different direction. And once there became more classes, more published works, more studies that brought out this different approach from top law schools, it led to this idea that we should formulate these ideas into one kind of theoretical approach, theoretical thought. And they came up with the term critical race theory. And critical race theory became this new form of legal scholarship that accurately addressed and unabashedly dealt with the much more accurate ways in which race played a key role in the lives of people of color in the United States. Right? It uncovered some of the very watered down, kind of desensitized conversations that were happening to help make America feel and seem that it had moved so far past its racial past. And critical race theory says, not as much as you think. While critical race theory is honest about some of the progress that has happened in this country, it also is honest about a lot of the perceived progress that leaders like to exaggerate and then bring about the realities of people of color in the United States, right? And so critical race theory essentially allows us to have this critical analysis that guides basic tenets. And these basic tenets are, number one, critical race theory recognizes that racism is ingrained in the fabric and in the system of US society, right? It is a part of the foundational structure of this country. Critical race theory also says that the individual racist doesn't necessarily have to exist for institutional racism to be pervasive in the dominant culture. It says that the power structures are based on white privilege, which perpetuates the marginalization of people of color, and that critical race theory rejects traditions of liberalism and meritocracy. Now, I'm going to go back and kind of explain all of these. Number one, we kind of already talked about this with systemic racism, but critical race theory basically precedes systemic racism in saying that racism is a part of the foundation of our country, right? We did a whole lecture on that, so we don't have to go too much into that. But the second one, the individual races need not exist for institutional racism to be pervasive in the dominant culture, says or responds to this idea that we're post-civil rights. Dr. King marched. We're better now. White people aren't as racist anymore. Or white people that say, how can racism be a thing? I'm not racist. I don't know anyone that's racist. I'm around Black people all the time. I'm around people of color all the time. My best friend is Black. My boyfriend is Latino. My girlfriend is Asian. I don't understand. My family likes them. I go to a diverse school. So a lot of times you hear white people say, how can racism be a thing? How can it be as bad as it was in the past? If I am not racist and I don't know people that are racist. Critical race theory says that's because racism is systemic. That's why we say it's systemic, because it is something that is a part of the structures of our society, not just the people that live in our society. Meaning you can have non-racist people in a society. We could snap our fingers and magically make all people in American society non-racist. That would not change the fact that racism still exists. Why? Because racism does not solely exist based on the individual actions of people. Racism exists because the structures and the systems within our society put forth by people in the past, built by people in the past, govern social life. For example, just because a doctor, one specific doctor, is not racist, does not mean that the traditions and the philosophies and the rules that govern the medical system don't favor men and disfavor women. It doesn't mean that they don't favor white people and disfavor Black people. It also does not mean that the number of Black women that die from childbirth issues, largely because of I don't want to say malpractice, but largely because of biased medical practices. And there's a lot of research to suggest this. Biased medical practices, they die or are hurt, or there are complications around pregnancies for Black women more than white women, even if the doctor themselves may not be racist. Why? Because of the outlook, because of the foundation of the medical system, because of the fact that, and you can read more about this in a book called Killing the Black Body by Dorothy Roberts, that the medical industry was built off of a man by the name of J. Marion Sims, who's considered the father of gynecology. And this man came up with a lot of his philosophies that are still practiced today by doing work on enslaved African people. He would cut them open alive. He would do surgery on them without anesthesia. Why? Because he was under the belief that Black people could not feel pain. This is why he did not practice on white people. He felt more comfortable practicing on enslaved Black women, cutting them open, learning their bodies in order to understand how the body worked. And this man is now considered the father of gynecology in the United States. That is racism embedded in the system, the foundation, right? And so even if you were to magically make all doctors non-racist, it still doesn't mean that the racism inside the foundation is gone. And this is not just in the medical system, this is in the housing. This is the redlining within the housing industry. This is the achievement gaps in the educational system. This is everywhere. This is the malpractice and the malfeasance in the criminal justice system, particularly around law enforcement. So these are the kinds of conversations that help early critical race theoreticians say it's not just about the individual races. It's about the fact that racism is institutionalized. It is a part of the institutions. It is a part of our voting practices. It is a part of the political structure, which is why you don't have to be individually racist to promote racism. Or you don't have to be individually racist. You don't have to be individually racist to promote racism. You can be a non-racist and still be a part of a racist structure, and there still is a need to fight racism. Power structures are based on white privilege and white supremacy, which perpetuates the marginalization of people of color. So that basically says every power structure in our society, every social institution within our society is built to help white people become advantaged. That's the point. Does it mean that some people of color do not become advantaged? Obviously they do, undoubtedly so. Right? Obviously there are certain people of color who are advantaged. But the system is not set up for them to be advantaged. The system is set up for white people to be advantaged. The system is set up for white authority structures. Tests are made by white people for white people, particularly white privileged people. Right? Laws are generally passed, first and foremost, whether consciously or subconsciously, with the advantage of white people in mind. And then other people may be able to benefit around it, but that's the general idea. We hear it all the time in politics, where people say rising tides lifts all boats. Well, if we just help everybody, regardless of your race, then everybody will, all we have to do is save the economy. If we just save the entire economy, then everybody will benefit. That's never worked, ever. We've been saying that at least since the 80s, at least since trickle-down economics, when Ronald Reagan said, well, let's just take this money, pour it into the corporations, pour it into the billionaires, so that they can continue to build these businesses that will then provide jobs for the middle class and the working class. That never worked. In fact, that exacerbated the wealth gap even more. And if you look at the trends of the wealth gap, it has increased significantly from 1974 until now. Right? So this idea that rising tides lifts all boats, if we just help everybody and we're not specific in our laws, we're not specific in our economic structures, we're not specific in our equality, and we just help everybody, then everybody will rise. No, and the reason why is because of that third tenet. These structures are not, these power structures are not in place to help people of color. They are in, or women, or other minority marginalized groups. They are put in place, whether consciously or subconsciously, to assist white, particularly white males. So it is important that when we address issues of bias, when we address issues of inequality, we are specific. This is for this group. This is for these people. Because if we just kind of keep it abstract, generally the advantage is always going to lean towards white people, particularly white males. Lastly, critical race theory rejects traditions of liberalism and meritocracy, meaning critical race theory does not believe that you can become successful in US society solely based on your merits. It does not believe that America is it does not believe in these liberal philosophies that have been created by early American men who are said to be forefathers and foremothers of this country, that said all men are created equal, that said everybody has a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that says that we the people of the United States in order to form a more perfect union, right? All of these liberal philosophies, this idea that capitalism or that there's this free and open market, all these ideas, critical race theory says, nah, it's not real. It sounds nice. It feels good around the 4th of July. Sounds great. It's cute when you put it in the K through 12, elementary, middle school, high school history book. But when we get to the reality of it, that's not real. And it's way too much evidence to support that that's not real. Right? So critical race theory rejects these traditions and challenges these ideas to say, okay, now that we've gotten past the feel-good stuff, let's talk about the reality. And so these are the 4 basic tenets of critical race theory. Now, Kimberly Crenshaw is one of the foundational members, one of the founding teachers, philosophers, professors to push forth this notion of critical race theory. She's a civil rights activist. She's a UCLA law professor, renowned scholar, teacher, writer, theoretician, everything, right? Kimberly Crenshaw is very, very important. And early critical race theorists. Now, if you click on this link, I want you to click on this link, and this is what she says about not just critical race theory, but now she's kind of taking us into intersectionality. So click on that link, and then we will talk about intersectionality more. So we see that what Kimberly Crenshaw argues with intersectionality is that it is this term that describes how multiple identities that we embody influence or play a role in the oppression that is forced by an individual, right? Or the oppression that is faced by an individual, or the oppression that is put forth by an individual, right? And so intersectional feminism is this kind of feminism that takes into account all of these different identities. And so it ensures that when we're talking about justice, when we're talking about inequality, when we're talking about critical race theory, we're not just talking about men, right? Because what critical race theory ended up doing was, while it brought out these ideas around race and the real racialized experiences of people of color in the country, it kind of focused on Black men, or it kind of focused just on men. And so the women scholars were saying, well, now we need to add on women's approaches. We need to add on the ways in which women uniquely experience racism and the unique experiences that went, because if we don't, then we won't talk about racism in the medical industry. We won't talk about abortion rights. We won't talk about the medical malpractices that leads to women, Black women, being more likely to experience pain or hurt or even death when delivering children. Why? Because Black men don't have those, well, men don't have those experiences. Men of color don't have those experiences. So they're less likely to think about addressing these issues. And you need women of color to say, hey, we need to talk about this too. We need to talk about body rights, right? And so intersectionality says we need to include other identities when talking about race, and not just gender. We need to include religion. We need to include class. We need to make sure that we're not just talking about the rights of middle and upper middle class women of color, but what about poor women of color? What about working class women of color? We need to include people of all educational levels, ability levels, sexuality, all of these other identifying factors that play into who we are. And then it was out of this notion of intersectionality, which I'm going to come back to, it was out of this notion of intersectionality that Patricia Hill Collins in 1990 writes a book called Black Feminist Thought. And Black Feminist Thought is essentially a text built off of Voices from the South by Anna Julia Cooper. It was written in the late 19th century, around the same time, actually 100 years later, that talks about, and is really the first text, first full-length text that really gives us a glance, a look into the unique lives of Black women, right? And so Black feminist thought kind of extends this tradition and provides this theoretical analysis of how to understand and discuss and analyze the lives of Black women in the United States, right? She uses controlling images as this approach to make, that is approach that is used to make racism, sexism, poverty, and other forms of social justice appear to be natural and normal. And we're going to talk more about controlling images in a second. But this is one of the theories that Patricia Hill Collins uses to explain Black feminist thought. And all of these things, critical race theory helps leads us into intersectionality, and intersectionality helps leads us into Black feminist thought to begin to advance the racial discourse in our academies that will ultimately influence the racial discourse in everyday life. So let's go to intersectionality. So to talk more about intersectionality, I saw this chart. I thought it was a really good chart. And it helps us understand the pluralistic identities that affect us, right? Taking myself, for example, right? Dr. Grant, I have multiple identities. It's very clear I'm Black, right? I'm Black of African descent, African American. Cool. But I'm not just that, right? Because it's also clear, well, some people may say it's clear, other people may not, but I am a male, right? The cis hetero male, right? So I'm not just Black, I'm also a male, I'm also heterosexual, I'm also middle class, I'm also from the South, I'm also educated, right? Post-grad educated. I was raised in within the Judeo-Christian tradition. So there are all of these. I am also, I'm not differently abled, right? I was also born in the United States. So there are all of these different identities that make up who I am, right? All these different identities that make up who I am. English is my first language. And so if we look at this chart, we see that there are all these privileges and all these disadvantages. The privileges that I would fall under would be being heterosexual. So I'm not oppressed in terms of my sexuality, being a male, being young, being fertile. I have a daughter, having had a tradition of majority religions, right? So all of these are part of my privileges. But also I fall under the category of being disadvantaged because I am African American, I'm Black, right? I am also So I'm a person of color. I am a darker skinned person of color as opposed to a lighter skinned person of color. That also plays a role in advantage and disadvantage, right? Um, let's see if there are any more. That might be it. I don't know if I fall under am I unattractive? I don't think I'm unattractive, but some people might. Um, Working class poor, right? Well, I grew up working class poor, but I'm not that now. So I would not be considered that now, right? So yeah, so there are forms of privilege I that I embody. Then there are forms of resistance, oppression, challenges that I embody, right? And so all of these things make up my experience. I don't just talk from the Black experience. I don't just talk from the male experience. I talk from all of these experiences. And all of these intersections of identities make up this person that is speaking to you, right? So if we go to examples of intersectionality, we see that a poor man who is also white and gay, that is a part of the intersections of oppression and privilege. Where is the privilege in a poor man who is also white and gay? Right? Where's the privilege in that? Well, the privilege is that he's a man and he's white. So those are two forms of privilege in our society, in US society. If you're a male and if you're white, you're already privileged in a major way. But what are the disadvantages there? Well, this person is poor and this person is gay. So these are forms of disadvantage that exist, right, within this person, all right? Same thing, a Latina who is highly educated, young, and able-bodied. What are the disadvantages here? Well, the disadvantages are this person is a Latina, which means racially and gendered, they are disadvantaged. They will be more likely to experience sexism and racism more so than the advantaged white male. But the advantage that they have is that they are highly educated, young, and able-bodied, right? Highly educated, young, and able-bodied. So these are the aspects of privilege, and then the others are the aspects of disadvantage. And this shows us that we are these very intersectional, complicated, dynamic beings. All right. So going to Black feminist thought and their controlling images, right? So the way in which Patricia Hill Collins breaks down one of the ways in which she breaks down the Black woman's experience in the United States is she says that Black women specifically are subject to controlling images that affect their everyday lives. Controlling images are simply put these media stereotypes that are put forth in Hollywood, on television, on radio, on TV, and movies that present this idea, this image, this notion of Black women, oftentimes in a degrading or in a degrading way that can then inform policy, practices, traditions that can lead to further disadvantage for Black women. For example, the image of the Black woman straight out of slavery, right, shortly post-slavery, was the image of this mammy, right? This mammy image or this bad Black woman image. So if you click on that link, and I want you to watch maybe the first 2 or 3 minutes, you don't have to watch the whole thing, but just the first 2 or 3 minutes, you see an example of this mammy image, right? So click on that link, look at this example of the mammy image, and then I'll come back. So you see that there's this big Black woman, right, who's ironing clothes, who is the mammy. She is the helper. You may have seen a movie called The Help, came out a while back, maybe about a decade or so ago. is probably the most recent image of the mammy figure in American history, where shortly after slavery, a majority of the jobs that Black women, particularly Black women in the South, had were these domestic workers. Essentially, they took care of white people, right? And white people's kids while white people were at work. And white men were at work. White women were usually home, but the mammy was the domestic worker. She got up early. She left her kids at home or wherever they were. It came to the white side of town and worked. Washed clothes, washed dishes, cleaned up, took care of the child, did all of these things. And then late in the evening, she would then leave the white household and then go back to her household, right? So the mammy was this image of this racial, gendered, and class oppressive image of the Black woman. She was seen as important because the mammy's image was this shaping of Black women's behaviors as mothers. They were these mother type figures, but they were only motherly figures towards the white children. Rarely did you see them interact with their own children because they weren't able to spend a lot of time with their own children because they had to work. So they had to go to the white woman's homes and the white man's homes, took care of their children. By the time they get home to their children, it's very late. Kids are hungry. They have to do everything and they can't give as much to their own children as they could to the white people's children in the homes that they worked in. Also, the Black mammy figure was very respectable. Make sure that you don't come off as disrespectful, that you don't talk back to Mr. whatever the white man's name is, Smith, Johnson, Washington, whatever. Don't talk back. Be respectable. Bow your head. Show grace. Right? They transmitted this respectability politics, respectable behavior to their children. Don't do anything to make Mr. Washington mad. Don't go stirring up trouble. That's what this mammy figure, that's how this mammy figure was promoted in larger media. Very nice, very sweet, didn't make anybody mad. Always said yes, always did everything that the white people asked her to do. Never talked back, did it well above and beyond the way she was supposed to do it. And that's the negative side of the Black mammy image. Because what it does is it promotes a submissiveness inside the Black woman that then she transmits to her Black children. And she teaches them to behave in the same way, in a way that does not teach them to resist, to be strong, to fight for, to speak up for themselves. Why? Because in that time, that could get you killed. That could get you hurt. That could get you fired from your job. And now you don't have a way of taking care of your children. Now, the second image is the matriarch. This symbolized the bad Black mother, right? If you've ever seen, some of you are probably familiar with Medea plays, right? The Medea character by Tyler Perry. This Medea character that Tyler Perry puts forth is probably the example, an overly exaggerated example of the matriarch media image in the Black community, right? Obviously, his is supposed to be very funny and over the top and entertaining, right? It's clear. But if you ask Tyler Perry, and he's talked about it, yes, he's trying to be funny. He's trying to entertain you. But it comes from, some of these things come from his real mother, his real grandmother, his real aunties in New Orleans, right? That was the inspiration. Obviously, they didn't act exactly like that, but that was the inspiration for the character, right? And that will probably be the most recent example of this kind of matriarch stereotype, right? And Tyler Perry uses it in entertainment, but then he balances it with these moments in his plays and in the movies where the matriarch would then sit down and come up with these wise philosophical sayings to help people navigate life. And Tyler Perry talks about how those are actually his favorite parts of the movies and of the plays that he would do, because it was his opportunity to kind of talk about the real things that he really wanted to say. The entertainment part and the funny parts and all of those were just, to sell tickets, right? But now I get to talk about real things that I'm thinking about, that I'm going through, that has helped me navigate life, that now I can give to the audience in the midst of all of the comedy and all of the craziness, right? So the matriarch symbolizes this Black, overly aggressive, unfeminine mother, this person that emasculates their husbands, that emasculates their lovers, that are mothers, but they're aggressive, right? And what this does is this allows the dominant group to blame Black women for the failure of Black children. So if Black children are going to school and they're not passing their classes and they're not performing well, and there are these achievement gaps, then they can say, well, it's not the school's fault. Look at the mother. She's aggressive. She's mean. She chases men out of her house. She's a poor example of a mother to her Black children. This is why they're failing in school. And Patricia Hill Collins says, no, this is not why they're failing in school. Patricia Hill Collins says, a sociologist, doctor, writer, historian, philosopher, sociologist, says that no, they're failing in school because the educational system is failing them, because they're coming from impoverished communities and homes, and many of them are coming to school hungry or without much sleep or in the same clothes that they were in for 3 days. All right. And so these are the reasons why a lot of Black children are failing, not because of this aggressive Black mother, but it allows for the Black mom to be the scapegoat for the failures of the US educational system on Black children. And so this is why the matriarch is this second controlling image that has been used to degrade the Black woman symbol in US life, the Black woman symbol inside of her race. All right. Actually, well, you know what? I'll go ahead and get rid of this part. We don't have to really talk about the Black woman's work part. That's a whole nother chapter. But we'll go straight to the third controlling image, the welfare mother. I want you to click on this link. This gives a very good kind of like example of the welfare mother and what the welfare system has done to promote this idea of the welfare mother. So go ahead and click on that, and then we'll talk about it. So as you can see, welfare essentially was created to help poor and working class white people out of the Depression. Over time, it became this stigma that was largely placed on people of color, specifically Black people and Black women, to suggest that it was this thing being used by poor, lazy Black women to get rich off of a system that wanted to help US citizens. And this idea that Black women were using the system to get rich, to be lazy, to sit up and have babies and not have to work, was created to then regulate so that they can take those opportunities away. When in reality, the opportunities were taken away because the idea was that it was helping less and less white people and more Black people, people of color. The actual numbers say that there are more white people on welfare, there are more white people on government assistance than there are Black people. That's the actual numbers. And so the welfare mother has this labeling as unnecessary and even dangerous to the values of the country of the fertility of women who are not white and middle class. It says because these Black women are sitting up in poor areas, having babies, depending on the government to take care of them, this is why we need to, and this goes back to the piece, Killing the Black Body, this is why we need to regulate these women having babies. This is why we need to regulate and find ways to encourage and in some ways even enforce infertility on Black women. It sounds like that's crazy. It sounds like, why would anybody do that? That's wrong. You're going to make these women infertile? You're going to force them to not have children? Yes. There's a long history of the US medical system forcing, largely encouraging Black women, and not just Black women, but even Black men, to be infertile. Fannie Lou Hamer, strong political activist, fought hard and long for voting rights in Mississippi. If you type in Fannie Lou Hamer in YouTube, you'll see this clip of her at a congressional meeting in DC, where she is speaking up for voting rights in Mississippi. She went to the doctor for a regular checkup, and she came out infertile. The doctors did a surgical procedure on her that she did not want done, and made it so that she could not have children. Now, because Fannie Lou Hamer is a American staple, because she was such a big political activist, that story is well, that story isn't even that popular. A lot of people don't know that story, but more popular than the hundreds, if not thousands, of regular, common Black women who have had that happen to them. George Washington Carver. You may have heard of him, right? Famous scientist, came up with all of these different uses of the peanut. Very, very popular, right? Professor at Tuskegee University. Well, he became infertile because when he was young, when he was about 12 years old, he started working in these white people's homes, right? As a servant. And they had a younger white daughter. And they were scared that this young Black boy was going to try to rape or sexually assault their daughter. So they forced him to go to the doctor and to, neuter, essentially. They neutered him, right? They created it so that he could not have children, right? So that his genitals didn't work. And now, if you were to type in George Washington Carver interview in YouTube, when you listen to him talk, he has a very high voice. Talks with a very, 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 very high voice because of that procedure. And he could never have children. These are the things that were done, right? This is a long history, right, of things that were done to keep Black people from being able to have children. And this welfare mother image is just a much more modern version of other images of Black people being hypersexual, lazy, poor, that encourages US society to pass laws and policies and practices to regulate behavior and control the natural lives that Black people should be able to have in this country. Right? So this is what Patricia Hill Collins is arguing. It argues that the fertility of women, but even men, need to be regulated. This welfare mother idea makes it content to just sit around and collect welfare, shunning work and passing on her bad values to her offspring. And it justifies the harnessing of Black women's fertility for the change of a political economy, everything we just talked about. So this welfare mother image justifies that. This is why we have to take government assistance away. This is why we have to regulate it so that it is only for a short period of time, right? Lastly, we have the Jezebel. The Jezebel is the fourth controlling image, and it is this image of the Black woman as this whore, sexually aggressive woman. We see these images in TVs and films. Particularly, we see them in maybe like popular music, particularly like hip hop songs and videos. And some people may argue that this is an image that is internally perpetuated by Black artists, Black rappers, perpetuating the image of the Black woman as a Jezebel, as whore, as a sexually aggressive woman. But there's a longer history of this being put forth by white men during slavery and after slavery, post-slavery, as Black women, and actually even pre-slavery, this idea that Black women were these very sexually aggressive women, culturally, that African people were that way, and that was used to justify the rape and the dehumanizing nature that was put forth by so-called slave captors on African people. And so this is the reason why there's this history of that, there's this tradition of that, and it has kept on in the present day, all right? So Jezebel is the last controlling image, right? That Patricia Collins talks about. So Sojourner Truth, this next slide, wrote, or she did a speech, and I think it was in Ohio, called Ain't I a Woman? This was in the middle part of the 1800s. And this speech, I'm not going to go over the whole speech, but there's one part of the speech where she says, that man over there says that women need to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches and to have the best place everywhere. Nobody helps me any best place. Ain't I a woman? Look at me, look at my arm. I have plowed, I have planted, and I have gathered into barns, and no man could head me. And ain't I a woman? I could work as much and eat as much as a man when I could get it, and bear the lash as well too. And ain't I a woman? I have borne children and seen most of them sold into slavery. And when I cried with a mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me. And ain't I a woman? And so this is really the first time that on a public platform, this idea of race and gender being problematized comes into play, where Sojourner Truth says, you white men are saying that women need to be treated better and women need to be helped over ditches and we need to open the doors for women, but you don't do that for me. Am I not a woman? Or does my Blackness make me less of a woman? Does my race mitigate my gender? Because you don't treat white women and Black women the same, but then you say we need to treat women better. Well, if we need to treat women better, then I am a woman. I should be treated as a woman. And then she says, and then if you want to talk about the strength of a woman, well, you don't inhabit the strength of a woman. I work as much as a woman, and definitely work as much as a Black man, because I'm working right beside him in the field. I'm working beside him in the field and I'm pregnant. And I'm picking just as much cotton. I'm doing just as much work. If you give me the food, I eat just as much food. And if I get in trouble, I get my back whipped just like he gets his back whipped. And am I not a woman? So Sojourner Truth is arguing that if anything, the pain, the internal and external pain that I feel as a Black woman, as an enslaved Black woman, is even worse, because now when I'm impregnated either by choice or by force, and I have my child, you take my child away from me. No Black man has ever had to experience that. Yes, Black men have had to experience their children being taken away from them, but not after they've given birth to them. So Sojourner Truth is saying, I have dealt with more oppression than any white woman, than any Black man, and I still don't have the privileges of either. And ain't I a woman? So this problematizing of race and gender that Sojourner Truth kind of started out with this speech sets the stage for your Anna Julia Coopers, for your Maria Stewarts, for your Ida B. Wellses, going all the way into the 1960s with your Angela Davises, with your Jean Toomer, no, not Jean Toomer, with your Angela Davises, with your who's the sister, Audre Lordes, on to Kimberly Crenshaw and Patricia Hill Collins, of how to understand the intersections of race and gender, and also to continue this idea and this rich history of Black feminist thought. And this last slide just kind of shows you a couple other people, Mary McLeod Bethune, Ida B. Wells, and Anna Julia Cooper, and others who have contributed to this discourse of Black feminist thought. So this is very important. We're going to, I'm not going to give you an assignment on this today or this week, because you do have your essay to write and you already have one assignment earlier. So I'm not going to give you another one, but I want you to focus on the essay, but this will be on your exam. So make sure that you're taking notes, you've read this, you've read the reading, you've looked at this lecture. And yes, hopefully if you have any questions or comments or thoughts, please reach out to me. Hope all is well. Hope you have a great day, great week, great weekend. See you soon.